my work is nearly always a response to something else, and that's quite important. So there's always something else that's a catalyst to the work that's made, and that's maybe important for the context of what we're talking about today. I'm going to start off with this picture of Clive Limpkin's book, The Battle of the Bogside, published in 1972. This book is as far away from a kind of a book you would use to refer to the history of what happened in Northern Ireland over the last, well, certainly over the early part of the 1970s. But it's a perfect example, though, of why it's difficult to use photographs at all in a historical context. Because photography is a notoriously slippery medium. You know, it's often presented to people as evidential, as a way of saying, look, here is something that happened. So therefore, this is truth, this is how you should understand it. And it's kind of presented often to us in this kind of journalistic context in that way. So no ambiguity. And even Clive Limpkin's book is full of these kind of journalistic kind of bylines, you know, so that are used by newspapers. You probably can't read that there, maybe I can read it here. The text beside this says, he screamed a speech of hate at the RUC before lighting and throwing each bomb. There was a touch of cinema about it. I love that, because it's a touch of cinema, all right. I think when you look at this book, when I first saw this book, I actually thought it was all taken in one day. It was maybe about one riot in the Bogside in Derry. It's not, it's a whole bunch of occasions where Clive Limpkin, as an English photographer working for a British tabloid in London, was flying back and forward to Northern Ireland and making these pictures. Very typically, and it's still typical in journalistic photographs of conflict and riots and these kind of situations, it centres on children. I looked recently at a terrible book about the peace line in Northern Ireland and actually counted up, I think there were 42 photographs in the book, and of those 42 photographs, 27 of them either had elderly people or children in them, because it kind of emphasizes, overemphasizes that, and simplifies, of course, that idea. If you put children in a kind of a conflict situation, it's a very emotive way to talk about what's going on. But actually, I think it's a terribly reductive way of dealing with reporting the complexities of conflict. You never get to the complexities with that kind of representation of conflict. And really, my work from the very beginning has been a response to that, and really how the construction of a representation around these kind of issues is something that is almost always suspect. I mean, unfortunately, the general public don't approach the representation of conflict with that kind of inherent suspicion in mind, and therefore, I mean, this is a very good example of it, isn't it? Very typical of what happened in Northern Ireland over those years. You know, two kids probably given a couple of pounds to stand throwing bottles and stones while 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 photographers stood making the exact same picture. It's from the Independent, 1989. So I've always been very interested in how art, and obviously particularly photography, has represented social fracture, disasters, conflict, all of those things really, at the kind of frayed edges of society, you might say. I mean, this is a print from 1837. I mean, just after the kind of invention of photography, but at a time when it wouldn't have been possible to make a photograph like this. And I've only got it here just to emphasize the point that, you know, through time, art and artists have been interested and drawn to these kind of events, disasters, things that are, well, otherness. That's the word, I suppose. Because I suppose there's, in the representing of otherness and the extremes of what goes on, there's a kind of vicarious way of living somebody or experiencing a life that's not yours, thankfully not yours. You know, I don't live in that place, thankfully. And that gets overemphasized, of course, through art practice. This is a lovely set of pictures, and it's a set of 3 stereo views. The date, I think, 1874. And they're from St. Albans, Virginia. And they are interesting because they are On the surface, not interesting. The images aren't interesting, and I like that. Now, of course, I am, in a lot of the later work, dealing with an aesthetic, and that's important too. There's a line between making work that is wholly conceptual and that is conceptual and not particularly aesthetically interesting, and I prefer there to be something that draws you in terms of the formal qualities of an image. This is interesting because it's the aftermath of a woman's murder. A school teacher, Friday night, coming home from school, primary school teacher, sorry guys, and she was dragged in the bushes, head over the head with a boulder, and died. Now, important to understand that these were sold as a form of entertainment, not as a way of reporting what happened. And those Mrs. Ball St Albans pictures were just that. They'd have been a talking point. And that vicarious thing's interesting in this context. People would have passed them around a dinner table to say, thank God that's not me. Or also to worry, is the murder in our midst? Or, the kind of excitement. And the same reason why our tabloids use that kind of imagery. And I could do a whole talk, other talk that I have about how tabloids photograph crime scenes to kind of frighten us in a way. But this actually says on it where the struggle took place. And for me, I love it because the body's not described. Actually, it's better because there's no body in the picture. And it's absolutely in line with what I do. The broken fence and the broken branches stand for the broken body of the woman who died. And in a way is much more evocative. The problem is we're completely desensitized to the kind of imagery that the media keeps throwing at us. Images of dead people and dead bodies, it's almost like fictionalized. Cinema has done that to us. 24-hour news has done that to us, and it's very difficult for us to empathize often with those kind of pictures. I spent a lot of time in Virginia researching those cars that I bought, and this is a photograph that I unearthed, and it's an execution in St Albans from 1875, and I can't help wonder if that is the Frenchman Baraboo who was convicted of her murder. I don't know, but it's not an image I'd be interested in keeping. I don't collect that kind of picture because of the kind of obviousness of it isn't particularly interesting, I don't think. So if we begin to think about conflict, the Crimean War is the first war really that was photographed, and Roger Fenton and Robertson both photographed that war. This is a view from Calvary camps showing people, horses and tents on the plain of Balaclava in 1855 from the Imperial War Museum collection. And what's interesting about those photographs, there are photographs to do with battle, forts after they've been ransacked, the very famous picture, which is this one, which is the Valley of the Shadow of Death, where the cannonballs stand for the dead, but of course the dead are never described. Politically, it would not have been possible for Fenton to have described dead bodies in his photographs, and that's why he didn't do it. A lot of people said over the years, oh, it was maybe a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. 3 years later, Brady was making pictures in the American Civil War that had plenty of dead bodies on the battlefield. But he had been commissioned by rich Victorian landowners to be in the Crimea, so that's why he wasn't making pictures of dead British soldiers on the battlefield. But for me, I'm glad he didn't. The way those cannonballs puncture that image, and they require us to project onto the image everything we know about the horrors of war, and we do know it. And people have often said to me, well, are you a critic of photojournalism? Are you a critic of news journalism and reporting? And absolutely not. What I say is it's just not what I do. And in fact, I almost require it to be out there because you can't read my work without a knowledge of it. And that's significant. Now, I made an image in Afghanistan, this image, which is kind of homage to that Fenton image, which is a contemporary image, really, to say that, in a sense, nothing's changed. And for me, the nature of the missiles have changed from a cannonball to a rocket, but in terms of what happens in war, absolutely nothing has changed. So this kind of interest in the kind of broken or kind of dysfunctional aspects of society has kind of run through a lot of my work, mostly using landscape to talk about these issues and avoiding the drama and otherness that you would normally see in, this is from a book, Invisible Cities, published 2006. And I should acknowledge, and I think it's important to acknowledge, where my influences were. I was taught by Paul Graham, who many of you may know, I don't know if you know or not, very, very successful artist right now. But his book, Troubled Land, published when I was still a student, so he was making the photographs in Belfast while teaching us, and that was very interesting. He showed some slides of the work in progress when I was in my second year at art school. And I was really puzzled when he started showing these pictures of Belfast. And about the fourth slide up was a photograph of our street. And I remember being completely thrown, and actually thrown in a sense that I couldn't understand why anyone would find the street I grew up in interesting. Yet it's in this book. And it kind of made me a bit angry, and I kind of reacted against it in a way that, Paul Graham kind of, what I saw as a well-off middle-class Englishman, in that typical kind of quasi-colonial history of photographers going to photograph the conflict, had done just that, drove his convertible Golf GTI over in the ferry and made pictures around Northern Ireland, and then produced this book. Maybe only 4 or 5 years later, with hindsight, I always cite that piece of work as the most significant piece of work that I came across as an artist from the very beginning, because it was the first time someone had used photography to take all of the themes and all of the subject matter of that conflict and deal with them with a very, very different picture-making strategy, and that unlocked all kinds of possibilities. This one I love of Paul Graham's, and it's the subtlety. And I think it's very important when we're teaching about art to be able to talk people very, very carefully through how meaning is constructed in an image. And I think if we did nothing else in our undergraduate in those days, and of course it was at the height of kind of photography representation, semiology, and Bergen, and we were being taught by Victor Bergen's partner, Anne Williams, and so the reading of images was absolutely paramount. But this photograph on the surface has very little meaning, but of course there are layers and layers of meaning once the context is revealed. So if you look very carefully, and you'd need to look very carefully at that projection, but there's a soldier in camouflage running across that roundabout. On the foreground, on the fence, it says "Touts beware." It says IRA. There's election posters on the lampposts. But look at the lampposts. The heads have been cut off. So it's at night time, there's no illumination, so it's dark. That's for a reason, obviously. Someone's crashed into the roundabout. It's damaged. And then the houses could be houses anywhere in Britain. They're very, very suburban houses. All of that adds up to an image that says on the surface in Northern Ireland everything was normal, but of course beneath the surface there was nothing normal going at all. Everything was kind of affected by what was going on, but everything in Northern Ireland in that context becomes emblematic. So a red phone box, a blue sky, and a white wall, that you just go everywhere, and you read signs, and you read the kind of political reading of the landscape into everything you see. And so Paul Graham said to me as a young student, you have to find a way to articulate. You're very, very different than my reading, he said to me, of what's going on in Northern Ireland. Make it subjective. Make it even autobiographic. These are photographs I made as a student, undergraduate student. The text is taken from a diary I kept in 1981 as a 15-year-old. And what they reveal, of course, is a teenager who was interested in teenage things and the normality of being a teenager. And interspersed with all of that, this awareness of what was going on around me. So 27th of October, went to Rab Maguire's, got my hair cut after school. Mum cracked up because I went down Castle Street in my school uniform. Dad liked my hair. Now the significance of that is Protestant school uniform in Castle Street, absolutely no way in 1981. One of my sectarian murder pictures I'm going to show you in a minute was a 14-year-old boy abducted and murdered because he was wearing the wrong school uniform. So that was very, very typical kind of thing went on. But the best barber in Belfast was in that street, and Rab Maguire was the man. So I literally went back to these places. That's Rab Maguire, sadly dead now, cutting some other boy's hair of course, in the present. And I think that's interesting, that slippage between the everyday and the kind of extraordinary things that were going on at that time. And I think it's important for us to be able to point out that in conflict situations, particularly where there's kind of long-term conflict like that, life does go on to some extent, to a huge extent, and people, teenagers are teenagers. Really from there on, I kind of thought, well, how do I make work that is something other than the way Belfast and Northern Ireland has been represented in the media? And it's very much been about how art practice can articulate something different or the same subject matter of journalism, but with the thickness, the depth that art can bring to those subjects. And I think that's a useful thing to be able to do. You know, the cliche of bonfire pictures from the north are kind of skinheads silhouetted against burning fires, you know. Again, straight to the point and simplistic. But that's what journalism has to do. You know, the way you consume a journalistic image is very quickly. You open up a newspaper, you look at that image, it has to scream out its meaning to you very, very quickly because you turn the page pretty fast. And you're unlikely to return to the image. The paper ends up in the recycling probably half an hour after you've read it. It means it has to have an obviousness about it, and it has to be immediate. So I think with art practice, and if you're using photography in art practice particularly, you've got to make work that I suppose it stands up to more scrutiny, that bears being returned to more than once, that doesn't offer up its meaning too obviously, that maybe has a literal meaning, but has other kind of layers of meaning within it. And I think in terms of teaching, I think when I'm teaching, there's a number of things we're trying to get students to achieve. Number one is to find their subject. So finding your subject is really key. Finding your voice then within that subject in your own way of telling it. And I think understanding how meaning is constructed in images. Because if you understand how to read an image, you can understand how meaning is constructed in images. So that understanding of how to read images and how to construct images that have layers of meaning is a very, very crucial one, and one we spend a lot of time talking about with students. So what I've done here, I'm kind of dealing with the spectacular inverse of the fires. So fires, you know, if you're going to photograph a fire, you photograph it when it's in full flame. So I've done quite the opposite. Went after the fires have burnt and photographed this kind of grey monochrome remnants of the fire. So they're not actually about bonfires or about Protestants building bonfires on the 11th of July. The series is simply called Fire Belfast. And titles, of course, are really crucial. And just knowing that they're in Belfast and they're of fires, you know, carries with it then enormous connotations that you bring to the image. People often ask me, well, is that the right reading of that image? Of course, there's no right reading of the image. The way you read the image is fascinating to me. The Photographers Gallery in London published a book, my first kind of big catalogue really, in 1994. I had photographed the RUC for a period of about a year and a half in Northern Ireland. It took a long time to negotiate that. But I wasn't interested in making a piece of work about the RUC, and this is also very important. The way I would work is that you get yourself into a situation where you can gather the images to construct the meaning that you want to construct. So for me, it's kind of like going, you know, I suppose if it was a painter, it's like going to an artist supply shop and buying lots of paints and then going and using them to turn into something. I go to a place or a location and use that to gather the images that I need to say the things that I need to say. It's never about documenting what's there. In this catalogue, we had a wonderful piece of work by Kieran Carson, the poet, who kind of responded to the work and made this great poem which just listed all of these items, you know, buses, tires, fishing lines, prams, coal, shopping trolleys, lampposts, hoardings, people, sand, breeze blocks, corrugated iron, buckets, dustbins, waste bins, scaffolding, you know, all of these objects, which are all everyday objects, but everyday objects in this context that become something else. And that's a fascinating thing I've dealt with really through all of the work, how everyday things recontextualized in these kind of environments become something other than themselves. These photographs of interiors of police stations and what they actually are doesn't matter. I did a talk last night in Derry and I was asked just that question, well, what was that actual space? For me, it's truly irrelevant what that actual space was. It's just important that what it could represent for me, this black chair in this black room that looks like a bomb-proofed room in the context of Northern Ireland at that time and in the context of the policing of Northern Ireland. For me, that's rich with all other kinds of meaning and significance that doesn't need to be explained. Because you see, if I was to say, precisely what these things were or where they were, the meaning is immediately closed down and limited, and that becomes kind of boring, really, and limits what the work can achieve. In terms of making this work, again, very important for me to pump, as Eugene Adjei said of his Parisian photographs at the turn of the century, pump the drama and the aura out of the photograph. That's what I'm always trying to do, so that the drama sits outside the frame. It's been said in my work that you want to get Paul Seawright's camera and you want to pull it back to see what's really going on. There's this kind of excluding of the context, because what I'm saying is the context is in your head. I'm not going to provide the context, because the context that you bring to the image is much more interesting than the context that I could show you. So, I mean, the context of this situation was a Republican funeral, and there were journalists making photographs of them trying to bring this coffin out of the house and all of the chaos around that. But simply I used that situation in order to make a picture of a police handler and his dog. And those teeth for me and the blackness of that image say more about that, the way I remember that situation and what it could kind of mean than I think any documentation of that event might have done. And this is one of the pieces from the IMMA collection. It's back to that idea that everything can be read in a very, very charged and political way. So the Union Jack Gate is a very good example of that, and the surface of that and how it's broken down and so on. So I'm going to leap back again really to the beginning to talk a little bit about the sectarian murder work, because that was very much about me being in England as a student, and this is the work I made when I graduated, which has kind of dogged me for years since. It's just been on in the Whitechapel in London. It was in the Tate Britain photography show last year. It's just come down from Poland last week, the sectarian murder work, and I look at it and feel uncomfortable because it feels like a naive piece of work to me now, but it has resonance, I think, because sectarian murder is not just particular to the Irish situation. And the way sectarian murder was often reported was this kind of sheet-covered body on the road, or seen with a long lens from the distance. The way it was also reported was also quite sectarian in itself, so the religion of the victim was nearly always in the newspaper report. So there's an example of one. So the text is taken from a newspaper report. So 30th of January 1973, the car travelled to a deserted tourist spot known as the Giant's Ring. The 14-year-old boy was made to kneel in the grass verge. His anorak was pulled over his head, and he was shot at close range, dying instantly. So the only thing I've changed in the text, I've removed any reference to his religion. And the way the photographs are made draw on a kind of forensic style that I'm interested in, that kind of pool of flash forensic style that I was trying to employ. And the way the work functions really is that there's a triangulation. You have the image, you have the text, and the third element is when you put those things together, the kind of space between the text and the image is where you imagine the violence. And I think that's much more powerful than the kind of immediate closure you get from the photograph of the crime scene with the body. That idea of using sites and locations where things happened is not one that's peculiar to my practice. It's peculiar to us in general. We love the idea that places have significance. When we go on holiday, we go to stand in places that are significant. That's from my collection, and that's a stereo view that says where Joan of Arc died at the stake, spot marked by tablet on the wall. I was doing a workshop, actually, a residency at the Art Institute of Chicago, and came across this guy, Ollie Watt, just amazing. You'll recognise that photograph maybe on the right-hand side, famous Nicot photograph. And this is his, Ollie Watts' Disasters of War colouring book. And it's brilliant because what it does is it acknowledges how naturalised in culture war has become. That we're so immune to conflict that we're almost comfortable with it. And he's obviously making a very extreme gesture by turning those iconic war pictures into a children's colouring book. That the children could innocently colour them and would feel that that is not problematic or not difficult. There's the image that it's taken from. Oh, I wanted to show you these. I made a quick few slides of these last week. Are you aware of Joe Sacco's work? I mean, this is incredible stuff, actually, and hopefully they're still published. I have 3 of his books, but his Palestine book is really fantastic. And if you want to engage young people, I mean, it's tough stuff. It's an amazing way to get them interested in a subject. And I think it's interesting because Joe Sacco was a journalist, a New York Times journalist, who kind of decided that there had to be another way to tell these stories other than acres of words describing what he was encountering when he was in these places. So 1991-92, he spent 2 months with the Palestinians in the West Bank, traveling, taking notes, interviewing people in the way that a journalist would normally do. And then he wrote and drew that into this book, Palestine, and it kind of combines reportage with comic book storytelling, which very emotional, very difficult subject matter, but really, really gets to the heart of the experience in a way that I think people would engage with. Really not that different what I'm trying to do. It's not about replacing one kind of practice with another. It's about creating a range of practices that deal with things that are dealt with primarily by mainstream media in a fairly synoptic and reductive way, usually. So, the mainstream media finds it very difficult to reflect the complexities of these situations. So, art practice. I mean, Seamus Heaney sent me a lovely note about the Afghanistan work, saying, it's so important that, poets and writers and artists go to places of war because we need other voices, other interpretations of what goes on in those situations in order to have a more complex understanding of their place in history and our relationship to them. And Sacco, I think, does that very well indeed. I kind of don't even need to show you that picture because that picture's in your head, isn't it? Is there anybody in this room that didn't have that picture in their head somewhere before I showed it? You need never see that picture again because the picture of what happened that day was, I mean, it's horrible to use the word perfect, but it was the most perfect television moment in a sense because history was kind of made, witnessed, disseminated and consumed in one perfect live moment. And it makes it unique as a kind of a moment, I think, in history of television and the history of conflict. So because you don't need to see it anymore, I mean, how do you make work about that situation? Because how do you ever compete with that image? But there was one photojournalist, and I love this little book by Frederick Sartreau, who realized that he was never going to compete with those images, and he then just spent that day making those photographs of people looking up. And had I not even shown you that and shown you these pictures, you probably would have known what you were looking at. Because the moment is so deeply situated in our psyche now that you'd have read that immediately. The look on those people's faces and the fact of that slightly raised look, I think you'd have known what they were looking at. And so much more powerful than the image itself, because of course the image itself describes something that is so alien to us. This describes human emotion. And it describes in a way that other image can't, of what happens, the consequences of witnessing those things and the damage that has on people. I was trying to find a way to make a project about the current conflict and America's relationship to it. I didn't want to go back out to Afghanistan or Iraq, and I wanted to talk about what's happening in America in relation to the conflict. And what's happening, of course, is that they are aggressively targeting the recruiting of young, poor, immigrant men and women. So it's a piece of work about military recruitment. So what I've done is I went to Texas first. They recruit more soldiers in Texas than any other state. Second, California, both on the border, of course. Also, more soldiers have died from Texas than in any other state. And I've gone to the sites of military recruitment offices. So they open these offices in these kind of Puerto Rican and Mexican neighborhoods, and they aggressively recruit young soldiers. So these are Mexican workers, Mexicans looking for work, standing, hoping to get picked up in Houston, Texas. Behind me, there's a little strip mall of 4 shops, so like a 7-Eleven. I can't think what the other shops were, but one of them would have been a recruitment center. So, you know, the tension between those two situations, you can imagine. So I put this image in, and you can't quite see it. It's not in the series. Just to describe, that says Armed Forces Recruitment Center, and where that American flag is in the background. So that's the kind of sites that I'm going to. But of course, the project, I would never show you the center. It's about the kind of frayed landscapes around it. Quite often they open these places, they're open for a year, maybe even less. They kind of suck in as many people as they can, and then they close it down and move to another part of town. So here's where one has been closed. That van says worldwide services. So there's lots of kind of text going on. You know, here, like a thrift store, those sad balloons, you know. I think this is Dallas, Texas. And this is the back of the recruitment, of one of the recruitment centers. So, you know, these kind of disenfranchised youths who have no chance of paying for an education, they also get a free education if they sign up. No jobs, they're really the target. So this actually opens in the Curlin Gallery in January. So if you're around in Dublin, you'll be able to see it. Thank you very much.